Yep. Okay, good morning. Welcome everybody to the Little Lunch Online. We've got a big day today, so let's get going. I want to start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, that we acknowledge their leaders past and present, and elders, and that we thank those people for caring for the land and the culture for thousands and thousands of years. I'm on Kaurna land, I'm in Adelaide, and if you could all do your own acknowledgement in the chat page, that would be great. There's a lot to do and say, but let's start in the best possible way. And we've got Asil to do an opening performance for us. Asil, you're on.
Hello. I am so glad that I am here today to perform, and I too acknowledge the traditional owners on the land, the Wurundjeri people in which I live and work. And I chose a song to sing today that I have actually never sang before, and I was supposed to, but my gig was cancelled, as most of the gigs, all of them. And it's also a surprise for Sarah and Norm that invited me to do it today. And I would love if you join me. There's a place where there was a place where you can join me singing, and I would love if you do that. Okay. في ليلة من الليالي لست أدري ما تراني ظلمة تغمرني غارا الأرض ضاقت والسماء وقلبي ما عرف الضياء والدمع بات يبكي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي عصيت والذنب كبير وإني في حزني أسير مقيد بالذنب يا غارا فهل يستحق يا إلهي العفو مجرما مقر بالذنوب يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي أنت الذي خلقتني رحمتني ورزقتني دوما يا ربي قد كنت معي لكنني نأيت عنك نسيت ما قد كان لك وسرت في طريقي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي اليوم يا ربي أعود من ظلمة خلف الحدود فالقلب منكسر وطرفي حائر وأنا الغريق فلا أرى إلا سواك لمنقذا لا منجى ولا منجى إلا أنت يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي.
Oh, Asil, thank you very much. What a lovely, heartwarming way to start the day. That's really good.
Thank you, Anne. It's like it was supposed to be together with another person singing Hallelujah in English, but at least you have me in here.
Ah, we have you. Not at least. We're grateful. That's fantastic. Okay, so we have people captioning today. Lachlan, Mana and Melissa when they need some backup. We have 2 Auslan interpreters, Susan and Liza. Liza's on now. For those people who need the interpreters, can you pin, Elliot's got instructions on the chat page. If you can pin, there'll be a changeover at each 15 minutes when you'll need to repin to the next one. Okay, so the purpose of today is to start to talk about what advocacy we're going to engage in the short term, and to begin a discussion also about the longer term. To think about the last conversation we had was given the current situation and the inadequacy of JobKeeper for artists, and even job seeker for some artists and arts workers more generally, that the people are now hanging on a very small $5 million resilience fund in the Australia Council. And so what is it that we can do, and how can we connect with other parts of the arts sector to do some effective advocacy with the community, with each other in the sector and with governments, maybe to increase the $5 million, maybe continuing work to try and get the other programs like JobKeeper to be more flexible and apply to artists, or maybe to get an arts package from the government, or all of these things have been discussed. And I think some of these discussions might be alive and well still. So we invited Wendy Ware from the Australia Council. She's the Executive Director of Strategic Development and Advocacy, to talk to us about where might we go with our own advocacy, what actually is the Australia Council doing right now, and what things can we work with the Australia Council on, and what things won't it work for us to try and be together. So welcome, Wendy. We're really grateful that you could come. I wonder if you might start just by talking about, you know, what does the Australia Council think advocacy is, and what are you up to right now?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for having me, and just acknowledging that I'm talking to you from Gadigal land, where I pay respects to elders past and present. It's really great to have this conversation right now, because I think we're at an interesting point, and I'd love to get the collective wealth of information from all of you, because I think there is a real opportunity to do some significant action over the next couple of weeks. So I guess to answer your first question, and I mean, advocacy, if you're to boil it down, it's about making a case, and it's about, you know, with an end game, I suppose, of changing people's minds. And one of the things that's worth being clear, because I think, you know, having worked in the small to medium sector myself for 20 years before I joined the Australia Council, I wasn't entirely clear about the Australia Council's role in advocacy either. And it's important to make that distinction, I think, between advocacy and lobbying, because there is a definite nuance between those two activities. You know, lobbying can be asking government to vote for or against policy or petitions or so on. But for council, our role is very much about educating and providing information to government to help influence policy. We don't make policy. That's the role of the Office of the Arts. And as a government agency, arm's length though we are, we can't lobby government. That's not for us to do, but we can provide a lot of useful resources and information to help others do that. We're also not a peak body. I often see the Australia Council referred to as a peak body, and we're not. We work with many peak bodies, and certainly are collaborating a lot around advocacy agendas with them. That all being said, we do have a really significant role in advocacy. In fact, it's one of our 2 core purposes, the other one being investment. But how we advocate is multi-layered, and it takes a lot of forms, and some of them are public and some of them are private. But more and more, we are trying to err on the side of getting more out into the public realm, because we know that that is where a lot of the power lies in terms of changing people's minds. And we're advocating both to government but also to the broader public. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But pre-COVID, and I know that seems like a very strange world now, our advocacy was very much focused on a public value agenda. For a long time, we've been telling the government and the public that artists were important. And to be honest, it wasn't really getting us anywhere. So we are focusing and doing all within our power to demonstrate the value that's created by the arts. That's the public value, which in turn warrants public investment. And there's no question that the value that the arts creates is multifaceted, and it's many, and that's one of its great strengths. But I think it's also in some ways been one of its weaknesses in the way it's being presented.
So Wendy, we really want you to talk about now.
Right now?
Like, yeah. What are you doing now? What's happening now that we could plug into, or where we might want to think of something else?
Yep, absolutely. So I do need to put a little bit of background in there because it kind of relates as well. So we have been focusing on a whole range of things of that public agenda. It's been the economic arguments, it's been the social arguments, and it's been the cultural arguments, but it has to be both. And one of the things which people, I think, need to stop doing now is making that false distinction between the intrinsic and the instrumental value of the arts, because the fact is that it's both. The arts do both. And for a long time, right now, we're in a situation where we are not being taken seriously as a true economic force, as a powerful economic force, despite all the data, despite all the information. Industries that are being, aviation, we're 6 times the size of aviation. Coal, we're 4 times the size of coal. We're the same size of finance. But we are not being taken in the same kind of economic terms as those other industries which are considered to be, the backbone of Australia's economy. And the flow-on effects that we know from the arts and culture as well are significant to all those economies, whether it's regional, whether it's tourism, whether it's hospitality and so on. And yet all those arguments aren't really being heard in a significant way. So one of the things that we really need to do right now is position the arts as an economic force. And a lot of the peak bodies have been doing a really great job in that, but we need to think how we transition the evidence that we've got into belief by the people who are in the policy piece. So that's one of the things that I want to talk to a little bit. We've been looking at where this has worked well. And one of the places, and we were doing this work long before COVID, but in the UK, creative work is seen as central to industrial policy. You ask any politician in the UK where the creative industries and cultural industries are important, they'll say, absolutely, it's the backbone of our economy. That's a place where we would like to be in Australia, but we are so far behind that curve. And so we've been working with the people who changed and orchestrated that shift in the UK. It took time, of course, it wasn't something that happened overnight, but that report, which many of you have been quoting with $112 billion contribution to GDP, was one of the outputs of that. So I guess this is one of the ways that the Australia Council is working in that space. Pre-COVID as well, we were spending a lot of time on cross-portfolio engagement. I think that work is still really important. So we've been working with Foreign Affairs for the last 5 years, and we've got to a really great place.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Can I just ask you to slow down just a little bit? I'm finding it hard to keep up. Sorry.
I'll slow down.
She's talking quickly because I'm leaning on her.
Yes, but I will.
You need to leave some of the background. I know you want to tell us the whole story, but I really need you to help us move into where we're going and what we can do together.
Sure, Anne. I will. I promise you I will. Hand on heart.
Like 2 or 3 minutes left before
right,
I have to let other people in.
All right. Well, I guess the short story then is that leaning on the Arts Minister is one way of trying to affect change, but we won't get where we need to be unless we have cross-portfolio engagement. So we need other ministers saying this is important, that we need to invest in the cultural and creative industries because they make a significant difference to our portfolio. We have a whole bunch of research where we've already commenced that work. So we with the tourism piece, we were making significant headroads into tourism. And if any of you watched the last Senate estimates before we went into COVID, that estimates was about politicians saying, we recognise the great value of arts in the community, in regional communities, and are going to be critical to the rebuild of those communities post the bushfires. And we need to invest more in the arts. That's where we want to be across a whole range of places. So it is thinking about what art is, but also what art does. It's about getting the right arguments into place. It's about having the evidence, which the Australia Council can help because we have enormous reams of evidence across a whole range of things. And then it's about exerting pressure and the right voices and thinking about who is actually going to influence the people who are making those decisions. Because often I think we think a little bit about our audience, but we're not thinking about who is actually going to have traction with that audience. And I'll be brutal here and say often it won't be artists. It'll be other people who are advocating on our behalf. So who are those advocates in your communities? Who is the person who runs that significant regional festival, for example, who has a connection to local government, who in turn has a connection to state government and so on, so that the pressure points can be put around and that bigger argument about the critical need for investment can come into place.
Great. All right, that's terrific. So what you're saying is that the focus of the Australia Council's work is about the economic value, the positioning the arts as an economic force, and that continues to be your focus. Is that right?
That is part of it. It has been about the economic value. There's also the social value and the cultural value and all those kinds of things. So we've been working in that space, but right now we're in an economic crisis and we need to make the economic arguments, and that's straightforward because it is a matter of economics.
And so the discussion that's going on about having an arts package, getting the government to increase the resilience fund, whether that's private or not, are you in those discussions?
Yes. So there's discussions happening every day with the Minister's office, and indeed a discussion this morning with the Minister around a range of areas, because JobKeeper will resolve some of the challenges, but we've been quite clear, and as has a whole range of voices from the sector pointing out the great big holes in JobKeeper, because it actually doesn't. So many of our sector fall out of that holes, and our own research at the Australia Council, 81% of practicing artists work from contract to contract. That's just the artists, and then you move into the arts workers. So we have all the evidence which shows where the holes are. One of the challenges that we've got with JobKeeper is it's all very well to say these people fall through the gaps, but then the next step needs to be about how do we provide the evidence of what needs to do to change that. So it could be about, getting Treasury to make that discretionary decision to enable, some of the amendments that were requested earlier. There's that piece. And the other piece that we're doing is actually doing a lot of modelling on where JobKeeper will work and where it won't. So organisations are easy because we've got data on organisations, and we've got reams of data, particularly, the partnership organisations, the former MPOs, some data on 4 years. It's much harder, and recognising that, by no stretch of the imagination does the Australia Council support all those 4-year organisations, all the small to medium organisations. The individual piece is the biggest challenge because there isn't much data on that. And even talking to the peak bodies who look after their specific parts of the sector, they are not in a position to actually put together the kind of perfect souffle of data that you would be able to do if you're an airline, for example. If you're an airline going under, you know exactly how much money you need to avert that crisis. When it comes to the culture and creative sectors, one of our biggest challenges is our complexity and our diversity. So what we need to make sure is that as a sector, we are coming together and with a united approach on those areas. There've been a lot of numbers out and people are coming up with different numbers that relate to their particular areas of the sector, and that's understandable. But we need consistency across the advice that we're giving to government about what the levels of support are, particularly because we're in a moment where the messaging is obviously every industry is in crisis at the moment. It isn't just arts and culture, but we are the hardest hit and we are a significant player. So that's the argument that needs to be made, and we need to be clear on how much we need.
So are you saying to us that the most sensible way for us to work with you at the moment is to use your data to build the case that we can see from individual artists and very small organisations towards their contribution? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and also thinking about the voices who will take that case.
Yes.
For you.
Yes, I did hear that. I'll come back to that. Yeah. All right, let me let a couple of other people in. Ben, you've got a question. Sorry, we've changed. Susan's taken over the Auslan, by the way. Ben, are you there?
Yes, sorry, I've just unmuted myself.
Well, Ben.
Thank you. My question is, Wendy, and thanks for being here. My question is, firstly, thanks for giving us that kind of précis. But I guess my question is, where is the advocacy? Is it just behind closed doors? Because so far, I don't think we've seen a public statement really from the Australia Council regarding, for example, the deficiencies of JobKeeper. Would it be possible to all of the insecure and precarious workers in culture that it currently doesn't cover because they don't work in a place for 12 months or more?
So there's a couple of answers to the question. Firstly, it is a combination of what's happening in, you know, the private meetings that are happening between Adrian and the Minister and the Office for the Arts and so on. And there's a lot happening there. And as I said, it's daily, and the amount of modelling that is going into there, quite frankly, is astonishing. But there's also quite a lot that is in the public realm. So we are working on that JobKeeper piece at the moment. As I said, the complexities, particularly around the individuals, are great. But we hope that by Monday, we will have a published piece that will identify in clear terms all the information that we've managed to gather, which is why it needs to be changing. We did a similar piece. One of the big issues right now is for First Nations communities. And when all those great surveys that popped up, you know, really quickly, I lost my gig and so on, one of the first things we did was talk to all the owners of those surveys and say we needed to actually coordinate so that we have a big picture, because if we've got this bit for the music industry and this bit for so on, we actually need to get some coordinated data and work out how, so we can actually present the big picture. And one of the things that became really apparent from those surveys as well was because they were done at speed and by people who weren't used to doing surveys as well. A lot of really important kind of segmentations, including about whether or not you identify as a First Nations person, weren't actually part of that data being collected. So the amount of information around how COVID is affecting First Nations artists and art centres and so on was really patchy and limited, and there were specific challenges. So we started weekly roundtables where we were getting the live feed from the sector, from the First Nations communities, with Wesley Enoch and Leanne Buckskin and others chairing those. But what was becoming apparent from there was that there needed to be additional work done so that we could actually make the case to government about the problems that were specific to First Nations arts and culture that weren't really being picked up through that broader survey mechanism. So we did that. We presented a brief to the Minister about that on Friday, and then we published the brief on our website. So that's the kind of approach that we're doing. So not only are we providing the information to government and the advice, but wherever possible, we're also making that information public so people can access it and use it for their own advocacy as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. Kathy Hunt.
Sorry, I'll mute myself.
Yes, help.
Pardon me. Sorry, Wendy, thank you. That was terrific, and it's really good to see all the work that is being done. I suppose my slight concern, I mean, around the whole thing is why a lot of the information wasn't there in the first place, and why, if we seem to have been pursuing an economic argument, I would have thought, for the sector for a number of years. And I would have thought that a lot of this information had already been there. So I think it is a good lesson for all. And I suppose what you're very much focused on at the moment is the immediate situation. And I think it's the advocacy, I suppose, I think that probably needs to be happening even now is it still needs a bit of a pivot, as everybody keeps talking about, away from this is not just an economic crisis, it is a health crisis. And first and foremost, it was a health crisis, and it has the potential to get even worse as a health crisis. And I think the role that the arts are playing at the moment in the context of that is also absolutely fundamental to the argument for any support or any additional support that might be being thought of from government across any sources in relation to why the sector needs to be supported. And I think there's nothing, you know, I mean, it's so blatantly obvious now, and it's in everybody's faces. It's in everybody's faces every day as soon as they open up their computer in the morning. So I would hope that from an advocacy point of view, we do not lose by just arguing down the economic line at the moment the significant data that must be being generated now digitally in relation to what the arts are actually creating at this very moment, in terms of making sure we're going to come out of this with some better arguments and some better framing in relation to moving forward into the future, including some good ideas as that we might begin to take forward to better thinking about where those support mechanisms and where the whole framing of the sector might go. But no, terrific. Thank you very much for that explanation, Wendy.
I couldn't agree with you more, Kathy. And I think that recovery piece, so, you know, there's been obviously the need to focus on immediate relief and sustainability and making sure that organisations come out of this as solvent, and that the individual artists come out of this and intact and able to, ideally still, it's a second moment for creative development if you were able to do it right now. And also recognising that long-term recovery piece is for, there's a real opportunity, I feel, in advocacy to argue for an arts-led recovery across all those facets that you were just talking about. It is about the social and it is about the cultural benefits of the arts as well as the economic. So we need to do the economic thing now to make sure that people can put food on their tables and roofs over their heads and keep the furniture. But the other broader piece about the value of the arts to the communities, which is, it's simmering there, and we've been watching some really interesting sentiment over time. So one of the things we do as part of our research, which is critical to advocacy, is track public sentiment about the arts, and we've seen some disturbing trends.
Sorry, I think, Wendy, I think partly what I'm saying is that I suppose in the advocacy piece itself that you're doing, by just presenting the stats, it hasn't worked so far, and we know there's been a massive failure of that argument so far. So in the context of you trying to argue even for the economic piece, it's the way in which it's done through hearts and minds rather than through the stats side of the story is an absolutely crucial part to even arguing the immediate, I suppose, is what I'm saying. It's we have to change the way in which we are doing this, not just what we are presenting. I suppose that's the point I was making.
Okay.
Yeah, as well. Sorry.
No, I mean, it's a good sort of segue into the bigger conversation that we just need to have now for the next 15 minutes or so about what is it that we think we should be doing, and then how can we tie that in with what other people are doing. So I know, for example, I had a conversation with Bethwyn from AMPAG this week, who is saying, how can we support what you're doing, and how can we put together what they're doing in AMPAG and what we might be doing? And I said, well, we're about to have a conversation and we'll get a few more ideas about how we might go forward, and then we'd love to have you come on, Bethwyn, so that that we can talk to you about that. Nicole Bayer's already online today, and I know that TNA are, like they've got plans. People are getting plans together. We seem to be picking up the people who are not covered in other areas. So a lot of individual artists, small organisations, community artists, people who've dropped through the cracks of the other areas. And so this group of people needs to have a voice. So we need to work out how to get a voice. And what we're learning from Wendy is, if we can work out what we're trying to say, we can use the resources that they've got to support our arguments. We need to find influential people to progress our arguments, but we're, and Kathy's saying, be careful what the argument is. So from our point of view, the argument's definitely not all economic. So I want you to think about and get on the chat page or put your hand up. Let's hear from you. What is it we should be doing right now? Who's on?
I think Ben might have a follow-up question there.
Ben?
Yeah, so I guess my follow-up question would be like, why can't we argue for a proper package? I mean, we've seen the Australia Institute argue for a $750 million package in the last week. Live Performance Australia has argued for an $850 million package earlier on in the crisis. There's pretty clearly a pressing need in terms of where the sector's at, the level of shutdown. The ABS stats show that half of all businesses in arts and recreation have stopped operating. So this is not the time for people to speak up and to take some risks and to be vocal. When will we? When are we? If there's not advocacy now, when is there ever going to be advocacy?
Ben, I'm not sure if that was directed to me, but if it was, yeah, now is absolutely the time, because what I was starting to say was that there's been some really interesting shifts in public sentiment as well. We were watching some declining and worrying trends through our art survey about fewer people feeling that there should be public investment in the arts over time. And that was something that we were monitoring really closely. With bushfires and COVID, I think we're watching a kind of shift in public sentiment about the art, because people are realizing it's, you know, it was that old thing of you're soaking in it but you don't even know it, you know, the Palmolive ad. But now people are starting to realize that without this as part of their lives, all those things around communing, of coming together, all the rest of it, that this is a massive impact on them. And I think so we have the opportunity with, when you've got the public saying this is important, and that Australia Institute survey was really great, because I think, I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but was it something like 58% were saying that they supported an art-specific package, and I think about 28% of them were absolutely supportive. So if you've got the public behind us as well, that makes a difference, because the public votes. So there is a groundswell, and there is a time to harness that and to say this is actually something which is important to your constituents. So if we can get that across a whole range of pressure points, then that can help improve the situation, I'd hope.
So Wendy, I mean, there's a bit going on in the chat pages, which is, if we were going to try and advocate for ourselves, who would lead that? How would we do it? And somebody said, is the Australia Council going to lead that kind of advocacy campaign for the whole sector?
I think it depends on what kind of campaign you're talking about. If it is a campaign about the value of arts and creativity across the board to all Australians, then yes. If it's a lobbying campaign, then no, is the short answer.
Oh, it doesn't look like lobbying to me, but I mean, it might mean talking to politicians, but that's not necessarily lobbying, is it?
No, there's a whole range of providing. One of the core things that we do is provide advice. So the advice that we are providing is the impact of what's happening on our sector and also the broader community, and that's, you know, so that's what we can do in our role at the Australia Council.
Nicole.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I've been involved in those industry roundtables for the last, how many have there been? 3 or 4. And it's interesting hearing from everybody, and I feel like what we've got to in the last week or so is actually that people are grasping for a different type of leadership, a new type of leadership. Certainly, you know, for me personally, I feel like I don't quite have the skills for what's needed right now. And I'm, you know, hungry for things about agile thinking and all this sort of stuff. It's a little bit like that creative process where you get into a really hard moment before you get, you know, before something comes up. And so many people are saying, we need a campaign, we need this, we need this. And it's because we're all scrambling around going, actually, we don't know how to do this. So I think that rather than jump onto something, we need to sit in an uncomfortable place for a while. That's what I think we need to do. And do lots of talking and do lots of exploring things and skill ourselves up a bit too, you know, like, maybe OzCo could help that, and I've put that in for the agenda for next week. Can we have someone talking to us about new forms of leadership right now? Because, yeah, the advocacy that we're doing at the moment, it isn't working, it's dispersed, there's lots of different voices, people aren't feeling heard. And so we need a new type of leadership, a new type of advocacy, actually, for now. No solutions.
No, that's, I mean, I think that's helpful, Nicole, because it's clear from our own chat that, you know, we don't know how to move forward. And maybe we need to think about it like, so somebody sensibly says, perhaps at the moment it's just each of us in our own community making it clear how hard it is for us and also what our value is. But to be honest, I'm wondering, Wendy, whether there isn't something a bit bigger where, as well as putting up the information that you're going to put up, that you actually put up some materials or so, you know, materials and say, could people distribute this information? So I've got it clear. We're about informing and educating people. So could the whole of the arts community distribute this information to the people in your community or something? I mean, Nicole's right, we need a new kind of leadership, but that'll be everyone taking leadership in their own space, but it still requires some kind of coordination, I think. What do you think, Wendy?
It does. Again, pre-COVID, what was really interesting was people were galvanising already, and by virtue of being at the Australia Council, you could see that there was, you know, Russell Howcroft did his creative speech to the press club, and he was mobilising a whole range of people in the screen and graphic design and advertising and agencies and so on. Evelyn Richardson was already doing great work with performing arts and live performance, and then you were seeing, you know, other work that was happening with Nicole and Bethman and so on, and it was like, when are all these wagons going to be hitched to the same train, was the question that I was thinking. Yeah, exactly. There is that big piece, because there is incredible strength in numbers, and many of the numbers that we are quoting in those, you know, those stats and figures relate to the industry writ large, and often, you know, a lot of those people aren't even touched by the Australia Council. So we need to sort of think about so with the LPA ask, which makes, you know, all the sense in the world, the Australia Council is one component about that, but it's not the whole piece because of the nature of the people who LPA serves. So I think, yes, I would agree that there needs to be a shift in that. We have been putting a whole lot of information in plain sight, I have to say, and would strongly encourage you to look at the COVID pages on the Australia Council website and spend time looking at all of those. And maybe we can think about ways that we can more proactively direct people to it. But that's one of the enormous frustrations when there is so much information that is there and available. There's electorate profiles, there's all these kinds of things that are really strong tools. And I think part of the things perhaps the Australia Council can do better is enabling the use of those things. So instead of just putting them out there, actually saying this is how you can use it for advocacy. And that's something that we have been looking at. We've started introducing webinars and things like that when we do a new piece of research, so we can talk to people about it so they can better understand it to use it for their own advocacy. But there's a long way to go on that front. Yes,
I think that's right. Helping us use it constructively. Kevin Brennan, you might want to just talk about the new way of talking about the arts.
Yeah, there's this is something I'm dealing with my students at RMIT, but also from my own lobbying and advocacy experience, mainly within councils. The arts is a dirty word, and how it's talked about seems a real problem. And I'm just thinking about, Fran Kelly was really supportive on AM on Radio National the other day in interviewing a few people, including John Bell. And she was really struggling to find the words to say why it's important. And John Bell also struggled, but one of the things he said is there's arts, by which he meant people like his company and the major performing arts companies. And then there's fringe arts, which is everyone else. And we've got a real problem in this definitional stuff. And I think it really has to come back to the sort of stuff Chris Puplik and Lee Tebret said. It's about culture. So it's about moving from focusing on this is what we want, because that's how we're characterized all the time. Chris Puplik said it in 2008. We keep saying, just give us money. Why are people going to care? Why would they give us the money? And one of the things we need to focus on, I think, is how can arts or creativity help solve these problems? Let's be problem focused. That getting people singing from balconies, getting choirs, getting music happening, that is an opportunity for all artists in the creative sector, but it's about the value for the public, not just the value for the artists. That's what they're interested in. And the value for the public is what we can do for the community to get through the health crisis.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I guess my point as a question, I guess, for Wendy is, it seems like there's a huge movement of people. We've got a lot of people here. We've got the old MEAA campaign, which I think is still ticking along. What's needed is some support to give people those tools to organise. And I think it's some sort of grassroots organising campaign rather than a centralised top-down approach to let a whole lot of campaigns bubble up. And I think of the Save Live Music campaign a number of years ago in Victoria. It's like, it's not one solution. We need to have the ask and then get the advocates, give the people the tools to advocate for the value of arts as a solution to this health crisis.
Yeah, I agree, Kevin. I think there's that difference between mobilising and organising, and we are really good at mobilising in the arts, but when it comes to organising, that's the bit that we need to work more on. And there's a few things that we are putting out there, including Amanda Tattersall giving a webinar, I think it might be next week, about some of the ways that we can do that, and giving people some of the skills to better organise rather than mobilise, if I can put it that way. But I agree. It's one of those things where people's minds won't be changed. And the problem with arts as well, you know, the brand issue with the word arts is that people always default to assuming that that means orchestras, operas and ballets. They don't see it as the bigger picture. But yet the work that sits outside of orchestra and operas and ballets is often the work that is the most engaged with by the community. So this is where we need to get that broader definition. Interestingly, if you talk about culture, people, when we've got some research in this space, and I know the New Approach is doing some work here too, people tend to think of culture and they immediately, you know, when you're talking about the broader public, they'll go to ethnically diverse culture and they won't see that in the way that we as a community probably would define culture. But when you put arts and culture together, somehow that causes the penny to drop, and people start to realise what actually sits within scope of that.
So I'm wondering if we could focus ourselves for a minute then on Kevin's suggestion, which, if I try and put that into a practical idea, would be, are there a small group of people prepared to work on some kind of a briefing kit, which are tools for people to use in their own community, and with all the important people they know, you know, that's got in it that's got in it some straightforward information, you know, main points people might have, things that they might send around. I don't know, but I reckon there might be some kind of a briefing kit that, with the help of Wendy and her team, we might be able to put together that's relevant for the people that we know and that we care about, who, you know, are not members of AMPAG or not in significant companies, who are not visual artists. You know, those are all parts of the sector that actually have people speaking for them, that we might be able to put something together that we can then share with all of us and say, why don't you take these things, take whichever of these is appropriate and take it up in your community. How does that sound?
I'll jump in. Look, I've spent a couple of years until after the election last year doing a lot of work with Get Up, and this is exactly, you know, they had a lot of failings, I think, in the way they went about organising, but it is about simply giving people really clear tools, and it's about helping people be clear about the language as well. You know, we're a community, not an industry, and I think it's starting to use that language of what that actually means. We do it for the love of it. Kathy's completely right. The economic arguments don't work. They haven't worked for 20 years. We know that. So let's actually focus on giving people the tools on how to talk about it and then what sort of stories they could use. Like, I just can picture, like, find examples of when creativity is being used to help people get through this crisis. And we're seeing, there was an ABC thing about that the other day. That's exactly what they're looking for. But there was no comment from our community about that. Like there was no voice to actually add to that.
Yes, and we're going to have to make up our own voice because it doesn't exist organisationally anywhere. Nicole, you're saying it would be a good idea to put that together as part of a bigger piece of work. What's the bigger piece of work?
I don't know. I don't know the solution. I was just going to write, I do think OSCO has a role to play. I think that the one thing that OSCO has is it has this sort of status because, you know, because it gives out money, right? Like that just automatically gives it this status and a place for all of us to look to. What we can get from OSCO is we can get that data. So, you know, if we get easier, quicker access to the data that you're pulling together now, Wendy, I mean, that's going to help us a lot. When Adrian came on board, you know, I met with him and said, I reckon that the sector can be used more. You can use the sector more for the work that you're doing. And that's going to mean a bit of a shift in thinking. You're going to have to use us as trusted colleagues and collaborators and to try and break down that us and them thing. And I think that is already happening. And with Wendy on board, I feel like that's happening. But we can do that more where we work together, and there will have to be trust, because I know that there are things that OSCO can't do publicly, but, you know, the peak bodies can do. So I don't know. I think the bigger piece of work is actually a whole suite of things. I don't think it's just one campaign. I don't think it's just the grassroots stuff. We need that as well. But we need, as I said before, we need the skill development, and we need collaboration, you know, across portfolios, across art forms, across peaks. And yeah, and keeping on doing things like this. So, you know, thanks to Arts Front for pulling this stuff together where we can, you know, keep nutting this stuff out.
So I've got about 10 minutes left. All right, so jump in if you want, but here's what I'm thinking. I mean, I suppose the thing that I know best is it's better to do something. Like start something. And I agree, Nicole, there is a bigger picture, but so maybe it's about community-based advocacy, and maybe that's where we could start. And that's about getting some kind of a story together and then sharing that story not only amongst ourselves but with the other parts of the sector. There is a business about skill development. You know, if we've got a bit of a story, how do we get that out? And so we can talk about how, and maybe talk, well, obviously the Australia Council's thinking about how to skill people up to be better advocates. And then there is the bigger question about how we collaborate. But I'm still thinking that maybe the most effective thing we can do for a start is work out what community advocacy might look like for us, and how that fits with what people are doing. Busty, talk to us about, you're saying already some people are doing this in their communities. Talk to us.
Oh, yes. Hello. Does this come up? Hello?
Yeah, we got you. Great.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's already happening. If you see, even from a health perspective, there are artists, First Nation artists, Black and people of colour, who are doing this already, like making sure that their communities know, whether it be a health and information campaign using the creative arts. You can speak on, there was just a campaign just recently that was a collaboration with for you know, across Indigenous communities, which was artwork, putting out like you know, some great stuff that we, you know, I don't think mainstream Australia even gets to see how brilliant that is. You have a number of artists I know in my community that are doing huge amounts of work in advocacy and grassroots organising and mobilising, because art, activism and advocacy are all the same thing. So there's this real idea that somehow it's all separate. It's not separate. And in times like this, in these unprecedented times, we need to like really look towards what has been and what is happening in communities already. You know, just the fact that we don't have enough First Nations voices in this conversation makes me go, okay, it's been separated out. Everyone's been separated into their groups. And even we can see that, referring back to that data collection, it's all been separated out. Nothing's been First Nations led. Yeah, so it's just, it's happening. It's just whether people want to come on board and actually support what's already out there. Because it's some great initiatives, great work. You have companies or organizations changing the way they do things. You know, even though like a company like Inala are up here, who have already changed their structure to be feeding elders, as opposed to like, you know, you look at like all the empty buildings around at the moment who are not, who could be changing their structure to be actually helping and mobilizing, you know, whether it's like a company, everyone has to move their stuff out of storage. Why aren't companies coming together and going, yeah, well, we've got space right now because there's no one here, you know? It's just that the way of doing things, because I suppose marginalized groups have had to do it continuously anyway. There's a real sense of, I find that my community has come together and gone, what are we going to do to help?
Okay, Busty, that's absolutely fantastic. And somebody's added that, sorry, I've just lost it, that the diversity community, diverse artists, here we go, diversity arts have got stuff up. So we have to have a look at what everybody else is doing. Build on what people are already doing. We don't have to create a new world, but there's some pulling together still that needs to be done. All right, I'm getting close to the end. And I'll try and summarise it in a minute. Norm, there's Melissa's raised the question about whether place stories might be a useful resource to for people, you know, to collect stories. Have you got a view about whether that's got another life in it?
The Upfront platform could be used for stuff like this. We're not sure at the moment whether stories per se are going to get us across the line with this current campaign, because we keep hearing back from these meetings with the minister that it's about data and numbers, you know, and I think Wendy was pretty clear about that at the start too. But there's certainly tools that people can use to connect and mobilise and share, and that's happening. People are growing the network through things like the Little Lunch, and there's others. How you bring that together, I think what you were suggesting before, it still feels like there's a role for council there somewhere in connecting some of these things, because it's the oversight, it's the national responsibility, and it's the capacity at that national level, which is probably one of the missing elements. And so it feels like that's an opportunity that we could kind of talk about here, to say, well, maybe there's a way council can keep any distance from what it sees as kind of political advocacy, but support the connectedness of different parts of the sector and awareness about everything that people are doing.
Do you have a view about that, Wendy? Have I still got you? Sorry.
Yes, I'm still here. No,
excellent. Thanks for staying.
It's yeah, I think it's a definite a good approach, and I'd support it. I think there's a lot that can be doing. I've seen that Melissa's popped in the chat as well. You know, you've got 10 years of arts leaders, and certainly we've been looking at that 600 strong cohort, thinking these are amazing people who are incredibly well placed, and how we sort of disperse information through those people to take out to their communities of influence as well is definitely on the radar.
So, Kevin, I note your comments about it would be useful if we had a longer term vision, and I know that's true, but I think for the sake of some immediate action, we need to be able to, we can't wait for having a longer term vision, but I think there's parallel work to be done here. And you've suggested a Royal Commission into the value of creative practice. How fantastic. And there's also, and you'll see on these chat pages and the arts front, there's the beginning conversation about living wages and sort of longer term, what's in the recovery phase. So I think we need to find a little group of people who will actually pick that discussion up and move it forwards. In the meantime, I'm going to try and put together some sense about how we might move more immediately, connecting with the people who already have got advocacy positions up, trying to get a story that's inclusive of all of those, and as Busty says, has got a really strong sense of being First Nations led, and that acknowledgement's there. And so I'll see if I can put together something that says maybe we could do these things and get a little package together that links to other people, and then we can start to try and link to all of the other organisations. I mean, obviously we need to build a picture that's not necessarily the same or coordinated, but is not inconsistent between us, you know, where there's a real sense of, we understand what the major companies are trying to do, we understand what our First Nations people are trying to do, you know, like we understand what everybody's trying to do, and that there's a sense of support for what everyone's trying to do, even if all the language is not the same. So as we move to the end of this, my suggestion is I'll have a bit of a go at putting something together that's come out of this discussion, and circulated, and then maybe like the week after next we can come back to it and see. As somebody's just said, NAVA's got an online advocacy program. So we need an advocacy position. We need some skill building. We need strong connections with the other people who've got it. And we're eventually going to have a longer term view, but we might try and work on something that's a bit more immediate. How's that going for you? Speak to me online.
I was going to suggest. I think we need to be doing that, and I think I said in the chat, I think we also need a comms strategy, and I think there's a role for OSCO and for Ben and others to actually think about how do we direct people to the site if it's going to be arts front site, like where are these resources going to be going, and starting letting people know that there is all these things happening, but it needs to have some sort of central clearinghouse. That's an issue that keeps coming up over the last 20 years, is how do we get this clearinghouse function and draw people's attention to it? So we need a comm strategy. We need people, I think a working group getting together those ideas about what are the financial packages, what are the rescue packages, how do we draw attention and mobilise people to various campaigns, such as the ones that Busty was talking about. It's like we could get attention to these things, and that would make a real impact.
Okay, I'm going to work on that. certainly with you, Kevin, and anybody else who volunteers to work on that with me, and then find a way to link with Wendy and the OSCO about what they're doing, as well as to anybody else who's interested. But we'll see if we can kick off a bit of a advocacy position that that reflects us. Anyone saying no? No, that must be a good sign. All right, so here's what I need to say. Wendy, thank you for coming. It's helped us not only to clarify what the council's doing, but to start to think about how we might work more effectively with the council, since we are the part of the sector that doesn't have that kind of clearinghouse. We don't have a peak body, we don't have that clearinghouse. We have to find new ways of doing things. So I'm really grateful to you for coming. I'd like to thank the captioners. No doubt that's been Lachlan and Manna and Melissa. That's no doubt been quite difficult. And particularly to our Auslan interpreters, Liza and Susan. Sorry we talked so fast. Thank you everybody for coming. We'll be online on Monday at 12 noon. Norm, anything else to say?
Just a suggestion from Sarah and I that maybe we put this next stage of the conversation in the time slot for Little Lunch again next Friday. And,
yeah, good idea.
Get a bit of action underway before then, and anyone who does want to take up Anne's suggestion of being part of a working group on these things, then please contact. And thank you again to Anne for leading us today. Yeah,
that's fine. And I just want to remind you that there are data packages on the Arts Front website. So if you know people who are struggling for data, let them know. Okay, everyone, it's been fantastic. Thanks, Wendy. Bye.